My daughter said it was just paperwork, nothing serious, just to make things easier. But that paperwork would have erased me from a $75 million estate. Hours later, I caught my son-in-law whispering that I was too old to fight back. The words shattered me, then hardened me. They thought I'd surrender without a fight. They will regret their words and their actions. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I sat alone in the old living room that smelled faintly of cedar and ocean salt. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, cutting lines across the wooden floor I had sanded with my own hands 30 years ago. I leaned back in the armchair that had carried both me and Elizabeth through countless evenings, and my eyes fell on the family photographs lined up along the mantel. Each frame told a story, and each story carried a price. I remembered the checks I had written over the years for Sarah, my only daughter. $60,000 for her 4 years at Duke, a sacrifice I made by cashing in part of my retirement savings. $25,000 for the used Ford Explorer, she insisted. She needed to commute to her internship. $50,000 for the wedding that she wanted to feel like a dream, with fairy lights draped over the trees and a string quartet that played until midnight. I gave it all without complaint, because that is what fathers do. I never counted the cost when it came to her. But now the very daughter I had carried on my shoulders was asking me to sign away what her mother and I had built. My chest tightened, and I felt a slow burn that was not just anger, but betrayal. The estate itself was no small thing. $75 million in coastal properties, 20 homes scattered along the South Carolina shoreline, each one a chapter of my life with Elizabeth. She and I had chosen them carefully, one by one, walking the beaches, running our hands along weathered clapboard, listening to the whispers of the sea. We called them the houses of wind and salt. Each porch had heard our laughter, each window had framed the sunrise we watched with coffee in hand. It was not just money, it was memory turned into timber, into shingles, into stone. When Elizabeth passed, she left me the keys and the responsibility. I kept them in a small iron safe, the same one where we had tucked away our marriage license, her grandmother's Bible, and the deed to the first house we ever owned. She told me before she died, her voice as clear as a bell, "Don't sign anything, Henry. Don't let anyone take what we bled for." That was her last command. And yet, only weeks after her funeral, I found myself cornered in my own kitchen with papers slid across the table by the very people who should have been my comfort. At the wedding, I had already felt the distance grow. Sarah and Ethan walked past me, glowing under the chandeliers, while I sat at a table tucked behind a pillar. I was not in the photographs, except perhaps as a blur in the background. Ethan's parents were seated closer, laughing loudly, while I could barely catch Sarah's eye. And when I did, her glance slipped away, as though she had already put me in the past. I brushed it aside that night, telling myself weddings are chaotic, and maybe she was too busy. But in the days that followed, her phone calls grew shorter, her visits briefer, her laughter thinner. And then Ethan's smile, that sly smirk when he leaned over with his lawyer, pushing papers across the table, telling me it was for my safety. For my safety. Those words tasted like rust in my mouth. It was the kind of lie that wears a mask of care but hides a blade underneath. When I refused to sign, his eyes narrowed just enough for me to see the truth. I was no longer a father to them, not really. I was an obstacle. A roadblock between them and the $75 million they wanted to hold. The pain was not in the money. It was in the memory of every sacrifice I had made for Sarah. I remembered carrying her to the hospital in the middle of the night when her fever reached 104. My arms shook, not from her weight, but from fear I might lose her. I remembered patching the roof of her first college apartment when the landlord refused to fix the leaks, spending 2 weekends and $400 of my own to keep the rain off her books. I remembered the nights Elizabeth and I whispered about cutting back on vacations, on dinners out, on new clothes, just so Sarah could study without debt. And now the same daughter looked at me with impatience, like I was a burden standing in the way of her new life. The hurt was deep, sharp, and it did not fade quickly. I asked myself quietly, does she remember? Does she remember the man who carried her in his arms when she was too weak to walk? Or is all of that gone, buried under greed? My voice cracked as I whispered it, as though Elizabeth might hear me from the other side. Liz, can you believe what our little girl has become? But grief slowly turned into something else. As I sat there with the late afternoon light falling across the floorboards, I felt the shift. Pain gave way to clarity. The betrayal was real, yes, but so was the responsibility. Elizabeth's voice rang in my memory. Don't sign anything. That command was not just a plea. It was a reminder that strength sometimes means silence, sometimes means saying no, even to those you love. I pulled out the small brass key I wore around my neck, the one that opened the safe. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from decision. Inside that safe was every document that proved what was mine, what Elizabeth and I had built. For the first time since Sarah and Ethan sat in my kitchen, I realized I was not powerless. Age may have bent my shoulders, but it had not stolen my will. I had a weapon, and that weapon was the truth on paper. I stood and walked to the safe, sliding the key into the lock. The metal clicked open, and the smell of old paper and salt air rose like a ghost. Inside were the deeds, the trust documents, the letters Elizabeth had signed in her careful script. I touched each one gently, as though they were relics. I pulled out the thick folder and carried it back to the table, setting it down beside my half-empty cup of tea. The steam had long since faded, but the resolve in my chest burned hotter than ever. I whispered again, this time steady. Liz, I won't let them take it. I promise you, I won't. My voice did not break this time. It was iron. The room grew quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I opened the folder and flipped through the papers, my eyes catching on signatures, on seals, on numbers that made Ethan's greed obvious. Each document was a shield, proof that what Elizabeth and I built could not be erased with a single pen stroke. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow I would call James O'Connor, the lawyer who had stood with us for decades. James had drafted the original trust. He knew the law, and more importantly, he knew us. I would hand him these papers, and together we would build a wall higher than Ethan could climb. My hand lingered on the phone, but I stopped myself. Not tonight. Tonight I would let the decision settle, like sediment in water, making it clear. Tonight I would breathe in the truth that I was not a victim, not anymore. The light outside dimmed, and the shadows stretched across the room. I looked around at the furniture that had seen the best and worst of our lives. The worn sofa where Sarah had once sprawled with her books. The wooden coffee table I built in the garage with Elizabeth, its surface scarred by candle wax and family dinners. The old quilt draped across the back of the couch, sewn by Elizabeth's mother decades ago. Every object carried the weight of memory, and every memory reminded me why I could not surrender. I felt the loneliness press against me, heavy and familiar, but beneath it grew something else. Determination. Tomorrow would be the start of a new chapter. Tonight was the end of pretending. I was no longer the father who simply gave. I was the man who would defend. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. Morning broke slow and gray, the kind of light that makes every surface look softer than it is. I brewed tea the way I always do, water just off the boil, a squeeze of lemon, and a spoon of honey. I set 2 cups out of habit. 1 for me, 1 for Elizabeth. Steam rose like a quiet prayer. I told myself I would not waste this day. I would not sit here and drown in hurt. I would move. There was a knock at the door, 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. Margaret? She stood on the porch with a pan wrapped in a dish towel, her hair short, her eyes sharper than any lawyer's. She slid past me as if she lived here and set the pan on the counter. The kitchen filled with the smell of warm cornbread and butter. She did not ask for small talk. She looked at the table, at the folder I had put there to remind myself what I was up against. She lifted the corner of the top page with 2 fingers and saw the words in bold, "Durable power of attorney." She let the paper fall back into the wood. Her breath left her like a measured sigh. "Silence can be shackles," she said, voice low. "Turn it into armor." I held my cup with both hands to keep them from shaking. She told me what had happened to her the spring after her husband died. A nephew with a honeyed voice brought a notary and a bouquet on the same afternoon. He talked about protection, about efficiency, about how she needed help with all that complicated stuff. She said no. He never called again. The refusal scraped her heart raw for months, but she kept the house. She kept her name on everything that mattered. I listened without interrupting. The cornbread steamed between us, the butter puddling around the edges, like sunlight. Margaret ate a small piece and left the rest for me. Before she went, she pressed a card into my palm with a name and number in block letters. "James O'Connor," she said. "If he is the one Richard trusted, he is the one you need. Make a rule and write it down. No documents at the door, no signatures without counsel. Drafts 48 hours in advance. Tape it by the door where anybody can read it." Then she added, softer, almost kind, "You are not alone in this. You have more power than you think." After she left, the house breathed with me. I found a pack of index cards in the junk drawer, the ones Elizabeth used to label spice jars. I wrote slowly, printing each letter as if it were part of a legal seal. No documents accepted at the door. All meetings through my attorney, James O'Connor. Drafts delivered 48 hours in advance. I taped the card to the wall next to the doorframe. The tape crackled in a way that felt like a small verdict. I stood there for a moment and read the words aloud. Saying them out loud turned paper into policy. I felt my shoulders settle. 2 days later, they came. Ethan's knock was not polite. It rattled the door on its hinges. I had the kettle on the stove, steam whispering from the spout. I walked to the entry and stood on my side of the line, one hand on the knob, the other in my pocket, holding the brass key that opened the safe. Ethan's smile was polished, the kind you practice in mirrors. Beside him stood a man in a dark suit with a briefcase. "Dad," Ethan said, as if the word made us kin instead of opponents, "we brought some papers to help you, just a formality, for your safety." He used the kind of tone people reserve for toddlers and the very old. He leaned in as though we were sharing a secret. The lawyer clicked the briefcase open and slid a thick stack into view. I did not open the door. I did not argue. I let my eyes drift to the index card taped beside the frame. I read my own rule, out loud, slow and steady, the way I taught children to sound out difficult words. No documents at the door, all meetings through my attorney, drafts 48 hours in advance. I could feel Ethan bristle even through the wood. The lawyer's face stayed neutral, but his fingers tightened around the handle of his case. Ethan waited for me to blink, to hustle, to apologize. I did none of those things. I stood there and said nothing. Silence wore edges that day. Silence held its shape. When he realized he would not be invited in, he muttered that they would circle back and stalk down the steps. Their tires chewed gravel. The engine sound faded. The house got big and quiet again. That night, Sarah came by without calling. She let herself in with the key I had given her years ago. She stepped into the kitchen, set her purse down, and looked around like she was visiting a stranger's house. Her eyes fell on the folder I had left on the table as a kind of rehearsal space for courage. She lifted the top page, saw the title, and let it fall with a flick of her wrist. The sound was small, but it cut me all the same. "Dad," she said, but it came out flat, like a word she was repeating in a language she no longer felt. "You are making this harder than it needs to be. Ethan says one signature will make everything easier. Banks, taxes, maintenance. You are a burden trying to carry all this by yourself. You are standing in the way of our future." The piece are, there it was, the word that lands like a stone, burden. I had carried her when she had a fever of 104. I had carried the roof she lived under when the landlord refused. I had carried the cost of college, the car, the wedding, each check written with gratitude. To hear myself reduced to a burden felt like being erased out loud. My throat dried up, but my back straightened. I did not take the bait. I did not jump into a fight I could not win. I let the first heat pass, then I set my hand flat on the table, palm down, like a pledge. I told her what Elizabeth told me. "I will not sign anything, Sarah." I kept my voice even. "If you love me, you will respect that." She blinked, once, twice, color rising in her cheeks. She called me stubborn. She said I did not understand how the world worked anymore. She picked up her purse. The door closed sharply behind her. The echo traveled through the hallway and stuck to the photos on the wall. I stood there, listening to it fade. For a long minute, I did not move. Then I reached for the phone. When James answered, his voice anchored the room. He said he could be here in an hour. He arrived in 40 minutes. He wore an old suit that had seen more honest fights than most men, his briefcase scuffed, his tie slightly crooked. He shook my hand and asked to see what they had brought. I slid the folder across the table. He read the top page, then turned a few more. He made small, thoughtful sounds in the back of his throat. "Broad," he said. "Immediate effect. No safeguards. Gives them access to everything." He closed the folder. The clap of the cover was the sound of judgment. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses and said, "You did right to say nothing. Now we put up walls." He took out a yellow legal pad and began to write. He spoke in plain language. Step 1. Re-record the deeds at the county office to refresh the chain of title, every property, all 20. Step 2. Freeze my credit with the 3 bureaus, Equifax, TransUnion, Experian. He would have his paralegal call each one while I sat there to get confirmation numbers, the kind of codes that matter more than keys. Step 3. Establish voice passwords at the bank, a phrase that only I could say, recorded and required for any transaction above a small threshold. Step 4. Healthcare directives. Name a proxy who would say no when I could not, if there were ever a moment when I could not speak. "Margaret," I said before he finished the sentence. "Make Margaret primary." He nodded as if he had expected that. Step 5. Put written rules in place with property managers and the bank. No address changes, no beneficiary updates, no conversations about my accounts with anyone not listed by name on a notarized letter. He slid forms toward me one at a time. I read each one carefully, painfully slow, then signed. He stamped them with a notary seal he carried in his case. The sound of the stamp hitting paper made a dull, meaningful thud. Each thud sounded like a beam settling into a frame. We called the credit bureaus on speakerphone from the kitchen. The hold music was thin and scratchy. A woman at Equifax took my information. She asked for my Social Security number, my birthday, and my last 3 addresses. She asked if I authorized a security freeze. I said yes. She gave me a code, 12 digits. James wrote it down in neat blue ink. We did the same with TransUnion and Experian. 3 codes, 3 locks on 3 doors. James slid a small envelope across the table and told me to put the codes inside and place them in the safe. "These numbers are stronger than any chain," he said. I did as he asked. We went to the bank the next morning. A clerk I had known for years straightened when she saw James beside me. She took us into a small office with glass walls and a heavy door. We set up a voice password, a nonsense phrase only I would remember, something Elizabeth used to say with a smile. I signed a letter that barred any address change or account addition without my physical presence and ID in hand. The manager read it and nodded. He was polite, and more importantly, he was careful. James asked him to put a note on my profile in bold. "Refer to attorney of record, James O'Connor, before any change." He did. We left with copies, the ink still warm. On the 3rd day, we went to the county office to re-record the deeds. The building smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. A clerk in a cardigan took the stack of documents and stamped each one. The stamps popped like distant firecrackers. Watching those stamps drop felt like watching masonry harden. James told me the recordings would be public within a week, that any attempt to complicate my ownership would bump up against these walls we had just poured. He had me sign certified letters to mail to the property managers who handled day-to-day details for the houses. The green return receipts would come back in a few days. We would pin them on a board, visual proof that the world had been told. That afternoon, back in my kitchen, we built a binder. He labeled it with a black marker, Estate Fortress. Inside, he put the new deed copies, the freeze confirmations, the bank letter, the healthcare directive, and a one-page summary of rules. I wrote my index card rules again on sturdier paper and slipped them into the first sleeve. He left me with instructions. If anyone comes, do not open the door. If anyone calls, refer them to him. If any paper arrived in the mail requiring a signature, do not sign. Bring it to him. We shook hands at the door. He squeezed my shoulder the way men do when they mean something they cannot say. "You are doing exactly what Elizabeth wanted," he said. I stood there after he left and let the words sink in. It felt like water after a long walk in the heat. That evening, I set the binder on the table and brewed tea again. I put one cup in front of the empty chair. I spoke softly into the room that held every version of us. "Liz, I kept my promise. I am keeping it still. They will not take what you built with your own hands, not a shingle, not a nail, not a dollar." The words steadied me. Saying her name steadied me. Outside, the wind pushed at the roses, and they bent, then lifted again. I sat there until the tea went lukewarm. Then I rose and slid the binder into the safe. I turned the key and felt the tumblers fall into place. 2 days of quiet followed. Quiet does not mean peace. Quiet can hum like a wire about to snap. I mowed the small lawn and oiled the hinges on the screen door. I tightened the screws on a loose cabinet pull. Small tasks, the kind a man does when he is bracing for a larger one. I checked the mailbox at noon and again at 4. On the second day, the green and white slips began to arrive. Return receipts, little flags of proof. I pinned them to a corkboard in the hallway with old pushpins. Each one was a small victory. Each pin held more than paper. It held the shape of a boundary made visible. Ethan texted me the following morning. He said he would stop by with a notary to get the last bits of paperwork out of the way. He used 3 smiling faces and a thumbs up. I did not reply. I forwarded the message to James. He responded with a single line. "Do not open the door." Around 3, a car pulled up. I watched from the lace curtain, the one Elizabeth loved because it threw soft shadows like leaves. Ethan got out first, adjusted his cuffs, and looked around like he owned the block. He had not brought a notary this time. He brought impatience. He came up the steps and pounded, not with the flat of his hand, but with the side of his fist, a shorter, meaner sound. I stood on my side of the door and felt the wood tremble. He called me Dad, then Henry, then Old Man. He said I was making everything difficult. He said I was risking the value of the properties by being stubborn. He said a signature would save me from paperwork I could not possibly understand. It would have taken very little effort to hurl words back through the door, to meet disrespect with a sermon. I chose not to. I let him pour it all out into the air. When he paused to breathe, I said the only sentence that mattered. "All documents, all meetings, go through my attorney, James O'Connor," I said slowly. I said it clearly. I could hear him exhale hard, a ragged thing. The handle jolted twice, like he was testing the lock. Then his footsteps retreated. Tires on gravel. Silence re-entered. That night, Sarah called. Her voice sounded thin, as if she had been crying or practicing a tone she could live with. She said Ethan was frustrated. She said I did not have to be so dramatic. She said it was just paperwork. I told her where the new lines stood. I told her I would not cross them. She started to say something else and stopped. The silence stretched between us, neither comfortable nor cruel, only honest. "Dad," she said finally, "are you sure you know what you were doing?" I looked at the corkboard with the green cards. I looked at the safe. I looked at the index card by the door. "Yes," I said, "for the first time in a long time, I am sure." When I hung up, my hands did not shake. In the days that followed, I acted in small, deliberate ways that would look like nothing to anyone who had not lived through this kind of storm. I placed a call to each property manager and confirmed that they had received the certified letters. I asked them to add a note to my file in thick, unavoidable font. No changes without my signature in person. I drove to the post office and bought a sheet of additional green cards, a stack of manila envelopes, and a black pen that wrote like a quiet promise. I made copies of everything and placed those copies in a second binder labeled with the month and year. I put the binder on a high shelf in the closet. If anyone ever asked what I had done to protect what Elizabeth built, I would not have to explain. I could show them. Paper, stamped and dated. Proof. There was one more conversation I needed to have, not with a clerk, not with a lawyer, but with myself. I walked down to the beach at dusk when the sky had that bruised color Elizabeth loved so much. The tide was coming in, smoothing the sand clean behind each wave. I stood where the water could reach the toes of my shoes and said the thing out loud that I had been circling. "They think I am weak," I told the horizon. "They think age means surrender. They think I will fold." The wind took the words and carried them, and I said the second part louder because saying it quietly would have felt like a lie. "They are wrong." It was not bravado. It was a simple, daily truth I would now live by. I walked home in the near dark, the boardwalk planks thumping under my feet like a heartbeat. On the 5th day, James called to confirm the recording numbers for the first set of deeds. He read them to me, and I wrote them down on another index card. I tucked the card behind the photo of Elizabeth in her checkered shirt, the one she wore on the day we closed on our first house by the sea. I touched the glass. The phone buzzed again with a new message, this time from a number I did not recognize. It was the county clerk, a courtesy call. She said someone had called asking about my files. She did not give a name, only said the caller sounded impatient and disappointed when she told him there was nothing he could change. I thanked her and hung up. I stood there in the hush of the hallway, the photo warm under my fingers from where I had held it, and I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph exactly, something sturdier. Control. Night fell. I made tea again because I wanted the ritual, not the drink. I set the cup by Elizabeth's place and listened to the house. It creaked the way old houses do, not from weakness, but from use. I picked up the brass key, felt its weight, then set it down gently on the table. I looked at the safe. I looked at the door. I looked at the index card with my rules, just to make sure the words were still there. They were. I breathed and said the sentence I needed to hear one last time before sleep. They thought I was done. The game has barely started. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The truth did not ask for volume. It asked for persistence. Before I went to bed, I checked the porch. The roses were still standing, a little battered from the wind, but upright. I left the light on, not as an invitation, not as a beacon, but as a declaration. This house is occupied. This man is awake. I locked the door, slid the chain, and listened for the click that tells you a line has been drawn. In the morning, I would drive to James's office to sign one more set of documents he had prepared. He said they were simple but important. A final layer. Another beam was fitted into place. I would bring the binder, the codes, the list of property managers, and the return receipts. I would leave with a plan for what came next. I fell asleep with the sound of the ocean in my ears. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke and heard my own voice in the dark, steady and sure. They do not know what I have in my hands. They will. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 2 below to let me know you're here with me. The first sign that the storm had shifted came with a phone call from the bank. I was tightening a loose hinge on the pantry door, the same hinge I had tightened a dozen times over the years, when the phone rang with a tone that felt too bright for the news it carried. The caller introduced herself from the fraud and compliance team. Her voice was careful, professional, but warm enough to land like a neighbor stepping onto the porch. She said someone had just tried to change my mailing address on a property account and add a new authorized name. She paused, letting the words register. Then she added the name. Ethan. It wasn't a guess. It was a fact stamped into the screen of her console, and she was reading it back to me with calm clarity. For a second, my mouth went dry. Not because I was surprised, but because the truth had finally shown its face without makeup. I thanked her, asked if the attempt went through. She said no. The freeze and the attorney of record note James had placed were holding. A fraud alert now flashed across every profile I had. No changes without my voice password and my presence. She could hear the air leave me in one long breath. She offered to email a confirmation and overnight a certified letter for my files. I told her yes, please. When I hung up, I stood very still in the quiet kitchen. The kettle began to whisper on the stove, then sing. I turned off the flame. I did not pour the water, I just listened to that last high note fade. He hadn't been trying to help with paperwork. He had been trying to write me out of my own life. I called James and told him exactly what the bank had said. He listened without interrupting, then asked me to come to his office at 2. He wanted to build the next layer while the concrete of the first was still curing. His office sits 2 blocks from the courthouse, a converted brick townhouse that always smells like lemon oil and old books. When I arrived, he already had a yellow legal pad open and 2 neat stacks of paper on the desk, one labeled bank, one labeled county. He nodded once as I talked, then picked up the phone and called the bank's compliance officer by name. He asked her to put our conversation in the file, and he asked for a written summary of the blocked attempt. He asked for a specific sentence that mattered more than every rumor Ethan had hoped to spread. No changes completed. Attempt blocked by freeze and attorney note. She agreed. Then he called the county recorder. He read the recording numbers of the first set of re-recorded deeds, asked for the second set status, and requested that a notation be attached to every property referencing the living trust Elizabeth had signed. It was not grand. It was not a gavel. It was the quiet machinery of order clicking into place. When he hung up, he slid a letter toward me on his firm's letterhead and tapped the page with his pen. We will serve this the moment they show their faces, or sooner if they answer a certified delivery, he said. The letter was simple and heavy at the same time, like a stone in the hand. All assets, valued at approximately $75 million, are held, owned, and protected by the Henry and Elizabeth Marlowe Living Trust, it read. Any attempt to alter, transfer, encumber, or access said assets without the trustee's written consent is unlawful. Any such attempt will be referred to law enforcement and prosecuted as fraud. Then another paragraph, colder. Cease any contact with banking institutions, property managers, or county offices claiming authority or requesting changes. I read the words slowly, letting the weight settle into the folds of my mind. I had been waiting for a line I could hold in my hand. This was it. 1 hour later, James's assistant handed me a copy of the bank summary. It fit like a puzzle piece with the letter. Attempt to add name, Ethan Carter. Attempt to change mailing address, denied. Attempted date and time, blocked for lack of credentials and attorney of record requirement. A compliance note, in bold. Do not engage third parties regarding this account. Refer to the trustee and the attorney. I placed the summary behind James's letter in a clear sleeve. There is a special kind of quiet that arrives when a plan stops being theory and becomes paper. The quiet that lives inside a courthouse hallway. The quiet that lives between a notary stamp and the lift of the seal. That quiet filled James's office. He saw it on my face. "This is the day the wind changes, Henry," he said, voice steady. "Not because you shout louder, because the rules are on your side, and now the paper is too. They came sooner than I expected. Ethan texted that he and Sarah were on their way to clear things up. He used a smiley face that landed like a sneer. James nodded when I showed him the message and asked his assistant to step out to the reception area. He kept the door open, not for eavesdropping, but so there would be a witness to tone if we needed it. The office is paneled in dark wood that carries sound softly. You can hear anger without letting it echo. When they walked in, Ethan led. Sarah followed half a step behind, her eyes red around the edges as if she had been crying or not sleeping or both. Ethan did not bother with pleasantries. "This has gone far enough," he said, hands moving as if he were playing to a camera no one else could see. "We're here to sign what needs signing and take the pressure off the estate before you ruin the value." He said estate the way a hungry man says sandwich. James stood first and introduced himself calmly. He held out his hand. Ethan looked at it like the gesture itself offended him, then shook it quickly. Sarah shook James's hand with a small nod and then looked at me. For a second, I could almost see the little girl who used to tug on my sleeve when she wanted to leave a loud room. Then the look hardened. Ethan spoke again. "We need to take over. He's too old to manage $75 million in beachfront properties, taxes, insurance, hurricanes. He'll get eaten alive." The office was warm, but I felt a coolness slip down my back, like shade. I did not interrupt. James gestured for us to sit. He turned the clear sleeve around and slid it to the center of the desk where both of them could read. He did not perform. He did not narrate. He just waited. Ethan read the first sentence and smirked. He read the second sentence, and the smirk died. By the third sentence, he was breathing through his mouth. Sarah read slower, and I watched the words register, a quiet wave moving across her face. The bank summary sat behind the letter like a witness with a perfect memory. Ethan jabbed a finger at the page and said, "The sentence men say when the ground tilts under them." "You can't do this." His voice cracked right in the middle of can't, a small break that gave away more than he wanted to. James stayed still. He pointed to the trust paragraph and said, with the even tone of a man ordering a sandwich, "It has been done for years." Ethan stood, then sat, then stood again, like a man testing the strength of an invisible fence. He said my name like a threat, then like a plea, then like a curse. He said I was humiliating my own family. He said the properties would lose value if we did not move fast. He said I needed real management. He avoided the word control the way a guilty man avoids eye contact with a mirror. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She swallowed hard. She looked at me and whispered, "Dad?" And just the sound of that word in her mouth almost undid me. Almost. I kept quiet and let James handle the law while I held the line. The letter lay between us, like a ruler showing where one person stops and another begins. James waited until the room's heat stopped dancing, and then spoke in the way a bailiff tells a crowd to rise. "Here is what will happen. You will cease all contact with banks, managers, and county clerks regarding these assets. You will not attempt to change addresses, add names, or inquire about balances or policies. If you do, we will treat it as fraud. Here is what can happen if you are wise. If Sarah wants to schedule a meeting to understand how the trust works, I will be here to explain it. But no one will be added to anything. No one will be taking over. The trustee is in this room, and the trustee is not you." He tapped the letter with the pen again, not hard, just enough to draw a quiet underline through every word. Ethan said, "You can't keep us from our family's future." James replied, "This is not your family's future. This is Henry and Elizabeth's property, and their plan." That should have been the end of it. It would have been for anyone who respected a line. Ethan cupped his hand around his mouth, like stage whispering to an invisible audience. "He doesn't know how to handle it," he said, as if I were not there, as if I were a piece of furniture older than the building. "He'll mess it all up. He'll die alone and broke with a stack of unmowed lawns." He said alone the way people spit. I felt the words hit and then slide off. I looked at Sarah and finally spoke. My voice was low, almost gentle, because rage would have made me small. "My daughter needs a father with a spine," I said, "not a father who signs away the life her mother built just to make a loud man quiet." I let the sentence sit between us, upright as a fence post. The room shifted. Sarah stared down at her hands. Ethan's jaw worked hard, a muscle hopping like a live wire at the corner. He leaned forward and hissed, "You won't do this to your own child." I met his eyes and answered, "I will not do this to Elizabeth." The name stopped him. He had never known how to carry it. He looked at James and said they would appeal, as if this were a contest with a judge and an audience and a prize. James told him there was nothing to appeal. The trust was active. The deeds were recorded. The bank was locked. He was out. The conversation fell into a silence thick as velvet. Ethan grabbed the letter and tried to push it back across the desk. James laid 2 fingers on the page and did not let it move. Sarah finally spoke again, barely audible. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Dad," she said. I believed her mouth and not her plan. Both things can be true at once. I nodded once. "Then stop," I said. They left with footsteps that wanted to be thunder, but sounded more like wet shoes. James waited until the outer door clicked shut, and then exhaled. He looked at me like you look at a man who just finished carrying something heavy up a long stairwell. "You did well," he said. "You didn't take the bait." He handed me a second copy of the letter and the bank summary and asked me to read a final paragraph he had added at the bottom of our version. "Any further interference will trigger immediate action in probate court and a report to local law enforcement." The words did not feel like revenge. They felt like a promise that someone would call the game by the rules if we had to whistle. He asked me to sign an authorization to file a notice with the court that the trust had come under attempted interference. It was not a lawsuit. It was a flare shot up in the night sky. "We see you." I signed. He stamped. The thud sounded like a heartbeat in a quiet room. By the time I got home, the bank's certified letter had already arrived. The envelope was stiff and official, the kind you do not tear open with your fingers. I used Elizabeth's old letter opener, shaped like a heron. Inside was the written confirmation the compliance officer had promised. The attempt, the block, the names, the time. I slid the letter into the binder's first sleeve, next to James's letter. 2 witnesses, side by side, both with clean memory and clear ink. I made tea because that is what I do when I need to swallow a hard truth without choking. I set 1 cup in front of the chair where Elizabeth used to sit and told her what had happened in the paneled office. "He said I would die alone," I whispered to the steam. "He misread the story. I have more company in a room of honest paper than he does in a crowd." The next morning the phone rang again. This time it was not the bank. It was Sarah. Her voice trembled. She asked if we could talk at my house. I said yes, and then I called James to let him know. He told me to keep the binder on the table and the door chain on the latch. "Presence changes tone," he said. "Paper changes memory." Sarah arrived alone. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the binder like you stare at a casket that holds a version of your life you don't know how to bury. She told me Ethan was furious. He called James a bully. He said I was cruel. He said the houses would rot because I was selfish. Sarah's voice cracked on the last word, not from anger, but from exhaustion. I touched the binder and slid it closer to her side so she could read the top page. She read quietly, tracing a line with her finger, as if the words could burn less if she guided them. "Dad," she whispered, "is this really what Mom wanted?" I looked at the window where the roses caught light. "Yes," I said, "and it is what I want. I want to be the man she trusted me to be." I could see the sentence land. She did not argue the facts. Her grief argued the feeling. Grief does that. It calls safety control and calls boundaries betrayal. I let the room breathe. Ethan did not give the rooms time to breathe. That afternoon, he showed up at my front door and pounded with the side of his fist until I could feel the vibration through the wood. "Open up," he shouted. "You think a letter will stop me? You think a little rule will keep me out? You're old, Henry, old. You'll drown in this. We are doing you a favor." He grew louder with each phrase, as if volume could edit reality. I stood on my side of the door and spoke with the sentences I had practiced. "All documents, all conversations, through James O'Connor." He used my first name like a hammer. I used James's like a wall. He shouted the line that gave away the whole game. "You can't do this to your daughter." The word "do" admitted more than he wanted. I answered slowly, every word like a stone placed. "My daughter needs a father who keeps his promises." Silence followed, not because he agreed, but because he had run out of script. The handle jolted once and then stilled. His footsteps retreated down the steps. The car door slammed hard enough to make the roses shake. That night, James called with news. He had filed the notice with the probate court. The clerk had time-stamped it at 3:17 p.m. The simple act of filing meant that any subsequent attempt to meddle with the trust could be shown to a judge with the arrow of time pointing in the right direction. He also told me the county recorder had uploaded the second set of deed recordings. All 20 properties. Chain of title refreshed. Trustee named. Notice to the world. He asked if I wanted to take one more step. He had drafted a short, polite letter to Ethan and Sarah summarizing the legal reality in plain English and quoting the bank's written confirmation. No threats, no flourishes, just the clean weight of what is. I said yes. He sent it by certified mail and email, both timed and stamped. Before I went to bed, I opened my binder, touched the plastic sleeves, and felt a simple, clean peace that is rare in old age after a family fight. The peace that comes when clarity does not need to shout. 2 days later, the moment that felt like a gavel without a courtroom arrived. James asked me to come by because the green return receipts from our letters had all come back. He had pinned them to a corkboard in his conference room. They looked like small flags, each one a witness. The bank's letter, the county's acknowledgments, the property manager's confirmations, the cease. The notice of attempted interference filed at court. He stood with me in front of the board. He did not deliver a speech. He tapped one green card with his pen and said, "Every one of these is a beam. This is not paper anymore. This is a structure." I nodded. I felt tall, not in inches, but in worth. As if the world had been listening for the exact moment we felt steady, the front door of the office opened. Sarah came in first, eyes swollen, a tissue balled in her fist. Ethan came behind her, jaw tight, voice already raised. He did not ask permission to enter the conference room. He walked in like a man rushing a stage, not to listen, but to regain control by force of lungs. "This is insane," he barked. "You put a black mark on us with the bank. Do you know what that does to our credit? You filed something at court? Are you trying to get me arrested?" James stayed seated. I stayed standing. The corkboard of green cards stood quietly behind us like a choir. Ethan's voice pitched higher. He called the trust a trap. He called the deeds manipulation. He called the fraud alert overkill. He called me cruel. He pointed at Sarah and said I was hurting her. His words came like a wave breaking against a seawall. Loud, impressive, but less water every time. James lifted the letter from the table and read in a voice so calm it nearly erased the room's heat. All assets, valued at approximately $75 million, are held, owned, and protected by the living trust. Any attempt to alter, transfer, encumber, or access said assets without the trustee's written consent is unlawful. Any such attempt will be referred to law enforcement and prosecuted as fraud. He set the letter down and added a single sentence that was not on the page. "This is not about winning a fight with an old man. This is about honoring a woman's work and a couple's plan." For a heartbeat, even Ethan went quiet. Then he lunged at a different tactic. He tried shame. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said to me. "You could have been generous and grateful," I answered, with the only line that had the right size. "I am grateful," I said. "Grateful for a wife who saw this storm coming and left me a map." He laughed then, a sound with no joy in it. "It's over," he said, meaning his plan. It came out before he could catch it. He rubbed his face with both hands and looked at Sarah, seeking an ally. She stared down at the tissue. She whispered, "I just wanted to feel safe." And for the first time in a long time, I felt the wound under the wrong. I wanted to gather her into my arms and tell her that safety does not come from stealing keys. It comes from building walls with people who love you. But I did not say it. She wasn't ready to hear it from me. The room knew it. James knew it. Ethan felt the ground sliding out from under him and reached for one last handhold. "We'll contest it," he said. "We'll make you look incompetent. We'll tell the court you're confused." It was the ugliest sentence of the day. James lifted a folder from his briefcase and removed a letter from my physician, dated last week, confirming my mental competence, my clear judgment, and my ability to manage my affairs. He slid it across the table like a quiet card in a winning hand. Ethan stared at it. He did not touch it. Something in his eyes sagged. "You set this up," he muttered. James answered, "Elizabeth did." They left without slamming the door. Rage had burned too much fuel. What remained was the thin smoke of a plan gone cold. When the outer door clicked, the room seemed to exhale. I sat down and only then felt how much of my body had been clenched. James poured water from a glass pitcher and handed it to me. "Some fights end without anyone cheering," he said. "But make no mistake, this was a win." I nodded and felt a wave of fatigue that was not defeat. It was the clean tiredness you feel after finishing a roof in salt wind with a man you loved. I said the sentence I had promised Elizabeth I would say if this day ever came. "They thought I was weak," I whispered. "Now they know the cost." I drove home on quiet streets. The houses of wind and salt stood in my mind, one after another, their porches facing a line of horizon we had watched for 42 years. The estate was intact. The trust was intact. My name was intact. But I knew the price of that intactness. Thanksgiving might be smaller. Christmas might be quiet. Phone calls might go unanswered. There is a kind of grief that arrives even as justice is done. I let it sit beside me in the passenger seat and did not argue with it. When I reached the house, I turned on the porch light and watered the roses. The hose made its soft hiss on the roots. The blooms lifted their heads like small lanterns. I made tea and set 2 cups, the second where Elizabeth always sat. I told her everything again, this time with the pauses she would have wanted, the small asides only she would understand. I placed the bank letter and James's letter on the table and slid my fingers across the paper the way you test a beam for strength. I looked around the room at the wooden coffee table we built together, at the quilt her mother sewed, at the photo of Sarah at 5 with sand on her knees and a grin so wide it broke the world open. I said the hard sentence out loud so it could stop hiding in my chest. Our family will not be the same. Then I said the truer sentence that had to sit beside it. But our home is safe. By the next morning, the phone was quiet. No pounding at the door. No new messages. Just the hum of a refrigerator and a bird tapping at the window as if checking on me. James called to confirm the court had filed our notice, that the bank had sent a final confirmation of the fraud alert, and that the property managers had all acknowledged our rules. "This is where Chapter 5 starts," he said, not like a writer, but like a man who knows phases of work. Consequences, cleanup, choices about the future. I thanked him. He told me to rest. Rest isn't easy after a storm. The body still expects thunder. But that afternoon, I lay on the couch and closed my eyes and did not dream of shouting men or slamming doors. I dreamed of Elizabeth in her checkered shirt, running her hand along a new beam and smiling when it settled true. Before the sun went down, I taped one more card to the inside of the front door. It wasn't a rule. It was a reminder. 3 short lines in my handwriting. I love my daughter. I will not sign. I am still here. I stepped back and read them the way a man reads his own vows. The porch light clicked on with a warm hum. The roses moved in the coastal breeze. The house held its shape. If you have ever been told you were a burden, if you have ever felt someone try to write you out of your own story, then you know the ache that lives underneath victory. You know how justice can taste like salt. You also know the quiet that comes when the paper is finally on your side. I stood in that quiet and let it steady me. I knew there would be more to do. Accounts to review, managers to meet, a simpler life to build from something complicated. That is what Chapter 5 would be. The weight is different now. Not a hand on my throat, a hand on a shovel. Feeling ignored and treated like a burden is hard, isn't it? If you believe every person deserves to be seen and protected, comment the word justice. Now watch what they will do to change that. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. I remember the morning James called and told me the papers were final. His voice was steady, clipped in that professional way, but I could hear the smile behind it. Every court filing, every county notice, every bank record was sealed. Ethan had lost any right, any claim, any shadow of power over the estate Elizabeth and I built. "It's finished," James said, and those 2 words felt like the first deep breath after a storm. I put down the phone and stared out the window. The roses in the front yard were heavy with bloom, bending low like lanterns in the breeze. For the first time in months, I felt the weight slide off my shoulders. I sold a few of the beach houses, the ones too big and too empty to mean anything now, and used the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in Elizabeth's name. It wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about turning Betrayal into something clean. 20 acres of land turned into tuition for children who would never meet me, but who would know her name. And I moved myself into a smaller house, a brick place worth about $220,000, right across from a park. The view from the front porch was not the ocean, but the laughter of children chasing soccer balls and the sound of dogs barking at squirrels. It was enough. More than enough. The silence inside that new home was different from the silence of the old one. The old silence had been filled with fear. Fear of footsteps at the door, fear of pens sliding papers across tables, fear of voices whispering in the next room. The new silence was gentle, like a quilt pulled over tired shoulders. I unpacked only what I needed: Elizabeth's quilt, the heron-shaped letter opener, and the binder of papers that had carried me through. Everything else I gave away. I no longer needed to be the keeper of walls too big for one man. I needed to be the keeper of peace. Ethan's fall was not dramatic. It was slow, like a roof rotting one shingle at a time. The lawsuits he had counted on never came, because the law was not on his side. The investments he had bragged about soured, and the friends who had crowded his table drifted away when the checks stopped. He ended up in a rented apartment on the edge of town, blinds drawn, phone silent. Debt collectors started circling. I heard through the grapevine that he had sold his car, then his watch, then anything else worth pawning. Sarah left him. She came to see me once, standing on the edge of the park while I raked leaves. She called out softly, "Dad?" I looked at her, saw the years of love and the months of betrayal all tangled in her eyes. I nodded politely, but I didn't step closer. I could not. Boundaries are not cruel. They are survival. That night I made myself a cup of ginger lemon tea. The steam curled upward, and I whispered to Elizabeth, "I kept it safe. For you and for me." The words landed heavy but clean. For months I had carried the fear that I would break the last promise I had made to her, that Ethan and Sarah's schemes would undo the very core of who we were. But now the trust was intact, the houses were guarded, and the scholarships were funded. I had turned betrayal into a wall strong enough to stand in any storm. I could finally rest. The news about Ethan spread in quiet waves. Neighbors whispered, old colleagues shook their heads. He had tried to climb too high, too fast, and now he was left standing on bare ground. Sarah, meanwhile, was trying to build a different life, but I kept my distance. Love does not mean blind forgiveness. A line had been crossed that no apology could redraw. She wrote me once a short letter folded into an envelope with no return address. I read it at the kitchen table, the words trembling between regret and excuse. I placed it in the drawer, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed it. I had learned the hardest truth of all. I did not need their approval. I needed my own. Peace is not loud. It doesn't march in with trumpets. It slips in quietly, like the light through the curtains in the early morning. I found it in simple things, in the whistle of a kettle, in the shuffle of leaves in the park, in the sound of my neighbor Margaret laughing as she watered her petunias, in the sight of children racing past my window with ice cream dripping down their arms. Peace came not from winning, but from letting go. I realized then that love without boundaries is not love at all. It's surrender, and surrender would have erased Elizabeth's name, my work, my dignity. By holding the line, by saying no, I kept the love alive, even if the family fractured. I didn't need Ethan's apology or Sarah's excuses. I needed the truth. And the truth was simple. Respect cannot be forced, and love without respect is just noise. One evening, I walked to the park with a thermos of tea and sat on the bench facing the sunset. The sky bled pink and gold across the horizon, and I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Betrayal had cut deep, but it had not ended me. It had forced me to find the spine I thought age had bent. It had reminded me that I was still capable of fighting, not with fists, but with paper, patience, and resolve. I whispered again, as I often did, "Liz, I'm still here, and I'm stronger than they ever guessed." Weeks passed, and the quiet life began to settle around me like a second skin. Then, one morning, a letter came in the mail. It wasn't from Sarah or Ethan. It was from a local charity group inviting me to join their board. They had heard about the scholarship fund, and they wanted someone with both resources and heart to guide their work. I smiled as I held the envelope, feeling Elizabeth's hand on my shoulder in memory. This was the path forward, not to live in the ashes of what had been broken, but to build something new, something generous, something clean. I accepted, not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted purpose. The past had taken enough from me. The future still had room for giving. I placed the invitation on the mantel next to Elizabeth's picture and felt the smallest spark of joy. I did not need them anymore. I had myself. I had Elizabeth's memory. I had peace. And now I had a new chapter waiting. I wake up most mornings now to the sound of children laughing in the park across the street. Their voices float through my open window, mixed with the chirp of sparrows and the low hum of lawn mowers. My little brick house, worth about $220,000, sits snug against the edge of that park, and I have found a rhythm here that feels honest. I plant marigolds along the walkway, trim the grass myself, and brew a pot of ginger lemon tea each evening. The big ocean estates are gone, sold to fund scholarships in Elizabeth's name, but I don't miss them. This small place is mine, and it is enough. Peace is not flashy. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or parades. It creeps in quietly, filling the cracks left by betrayal. I sit on my porch and watch the sun bleed orange behind the oak trees, and I feel something I thought I'd lost, contentment. Sometimes I whisper Elizabeth's name, and I swear the wind answers back. She is still here, stitched into the quilt on my couch, the photograph on the mantel, the rhythm of my heartbeat. And I know she is proud that I kept her legacy intact. I have learned something the hard way. Blood ties can twist, they can fray, they can even betray. But self-respect, once guarded, never abandons you. That's the anchor I hold to now. My daughter Sarah may someday rebuild her life, but the trust we lost cannot be stapled back together with apologies. And Ethan, his name is little more than an echo these days. He lives in a shabby apartment on the edge of town, a far cry from the life of luxury he thought he deserved. People whisper that he is drowning in debt, scrambling from one odd job to another. He wrote me a letter filled with shaky words of regret. I read the first line, then folded it shut. I did not answer. I told myself the truth out loud. I don't need their apologies. I have my life. Sarah has not fallen as far. She works now, steady hours at a local clinic, and neighbors say she walks softer, her pride tempered by the fire of her mistakes. She has reached out in small ways, a holiday card, a voicemail, but I keep my replies brief and distant. Love does not mean blind forgiveness. Trust, once broken, needs time, and sometimes it never returns. She may have learned her lesson, but my heart will not gamble again. One afternoon, while helping at the local charity group I joined, I met a man with silver hair and calloused hands. His name was Tom, and he told me in a trembling voice that his own sons had forced him out of the family home, sold it for profit, and left him with nothing. As he spoke, I felt the old wound in my chest stir. I shared my story, quietly, each detail of how Ethan and Sarah tried to erase me with a single signature. The room went silent. Some people cried, others simply bowed their heads. In that circle, I realized something. Betrayal was not just mine to carry. It was a burden many bore, hidden behind polite smiles and closed curtains. And by speaking it, I lightened not just my own load, but theirs too. When the meeting ended, Tom gripped my hand with a strength that belied his years. "You gave me hope," he whispered. That night I walked home through the park, the lamplight falling in broken circles across the path, and I felt lighter. Sharing my pain had turned it into something useful, something almost holy. Life now is not grand, but it is real. I water the flowers. I walk to the library. I sit with Margaret on her porch and share slices of cornbread while we talk about the weather and grandchildren. And each day I remind myself of the truth I nearly forgot in the storm of betrayal. Dignity is worth more than any inheritance. Boundaries are not walls against love. They are the frame that keeps love from collapsing. The lessons are clear to me now. For parents, I say this: never let your sacrifices blind you to the need for boundaries. Love deeply, but guard wisely. For children, I offer this: gratitude is not optional. To betray the hands that raised you is to wound yourself most of all. And about human nature in this modern world, self-interest will always lurk, sharper now than ever, but so does resilience. Betrayal may shake you, but it cannot define you unless you let it. I sit tonight with my tea steaming on the table, the quilt pulled around my shoulders, and I look out at the lights of the park. My phone buzzes once, another number I don't recognize. I turn it face down. I don't need to answer anymore. My boundaries hold. My peace is intact. I whisper one last truth into the quiet room, for Elizabeth, for myself, maybe for anyone who listens beyond the walls. Family is not blood alone. Family is the people who respect you. Character is the only inheritance no one can steal. And with that, I close my eyes, content, knowing that my story has come full circle, and that every day from here on out is proof that I chose right. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.